Good evening. Welcome to everyone joining us tonight. My name is Dorothy Gale, and I've been chair of the program committee of the Northumberland Learning Connection since December 2019, just in time for COVID-19 to mess up our scheduled speaker series. One of our audiences remarked lately that the Northumberland Learning Connection has moved to current events from a traditionally more academic-based speaker series. Let me assure you that this change is due to the one-off nature of Zoom events rather than the biannual 6-week speaker series in which we are able to develop themes more completely. The current COVID format has some benefits and some limitations. We always welcome audience feedback, but more on that later from NLC Board Chair Elizabeth Ivory. The COVID pandemic has occupied us for the past year, disrupting our lives, holding on many of us housebound except for essential outings. We all have COVID fatigue, even the introverts who like their solitude. Vaccines on the horizons are tempered by the threat of emerging variants of concern. Experts warn us not to let down our guard. Some predict a third wave, and you've heard that today in Ontario, if we relax too soon. Are we at a pandemic pivot point? Is the end really in sight? What else can go wrong? What about the developing world where vaccines are in short supply? Will the virus continue to circulate there, mutate, and constantly pose a threat? Will WHO warn us earlier next time? As expressed in the title of a recent publication of Peter Loewen's, waiting is the hardest part. I am pleased to introduce Peter Loewen and Jamison Steeve to talk to us tonight on the anniversary of WHO declaring COVID-19 a global pandemic. It's been quite a year. And now with COVID fatigue setting in and the specter of a federal election stoking partisanship, the blame game has taken over earlier cross-party consensus. We've seen the polarized COVID response in the United States and the role of social media, right-wing conspiracy theories, and biased media reporting. But what's going on in Canada? Peter Loewen is a professor of political science and associate director, global engagement at the Monk School. He's also director of the Policy, Elections, and Representations Lab, PEARL, research lead at the Schwartz-Reisman Institute, and senior fellow at Massey College, all at the University of Toronto. He is interested in how politicians can make better decisions and in how citizens can make better choices. In the past year, he has focused his research on understanding the social context and consequences of COVID. Along with other publications, he has written the first 2 of a 6-part series for the Public Policy Forum on attitudes about COVID-19, vaccine hesitancy, public trust, and support for government, and how this changes over time. Jamison is Senior Advisor, Policy and Solutions at the Schwartz-Reisman Institute for Technology and Society at the University of Toronto. He is also a Senior Fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute and a Fellow at the Public Policy Forum. Formerly, Jamison was Executive Director of the Martin Prosperity Institute at the Rotman School of Management and at the Institute for Competitiveness and Prosperity, 2 of Canada's leading think tanks. I always thought it would be interesting to be in charge of a think tank. His career has been in the area of public policy, starting with a number of high-level provincial government roles under Dalton McGuinty. Our format tonight is similar to previous NLC webinars. We'll start with a short presentation by Peter, followed by an interview with Jamison, while you formulate your own questions. Jamison and Peter will respond to audience questions from about 8:15 before the webinar is closed by NLC's board chair, Elizabeth Ivory. Do send in your questions using the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen. You can type in these questions as they occur to you. Peter has assured me that after screening University of Toronto student questions, nothing will throw him off his stride. So with that, over to Peter, and then Jamison will come in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dorothy, for that really kind introduction, and thanks to everyone who's joining us on Thursday evening. It is an auspicious date, of course. We're now 1 year out from the World Health Organization declaring COVID-19 and SARS-CoV-2, the virus which causes it, a global pandemic. And if you were like me, you didn't really know how long this was going to last. And if you were like me, you were on the wrong side of it, and that you underestimated it dramatically for how long it would go on for. So I just want to take a second at the start of this to say that that with the number of people who are here, odds on, some of you have been touched very deeply and tragically by COVID, and I'm sorry for that. And I'm sorry for everyone who's had to go through so much loss over the last year of seeing grandkids, of seeing friends, lost social time, lost educational opportunities. For me, the last year has been a challenging, exhilarating, stimulating, frustrating time. There's any number of other adjectives I can use, but as a person who's a social researcher, who's interested in people and what they think about politics and what they think about public and the public life and how they respond and how they behave in the public sphere, the last year has been a fascinating window into both politicians and the difficult jobs they do, but also humans, regular people, citizens, and how they respond to some of the deepest, biggest challenges that they can be presented with. So what I want to do tonight is I want to present you with some data from my lab, and I'll tell you about where those data come from in a second. But what I want to do is to bring together 2 or 3 strands of data to tell a story about this moment that we're in right now. And I'll tell you that by telling you kind of how we got here. So here's what the data are. I'm a person who studies politicians and I study citizens. So since the end of March, my research lab at the University of Toronto has been interviewing around about 2,500 Canadians every week. Those Canadians, it's a different set every week, and they represent a representative sample of the country. So what these people tell us, we can generalize out to other people in the country. And we've been asking them a number of questions about their beliefs about COVID, their knowledge of it, their concerns about COVID, the behaviors they're taking in response to it. We asked them about their views of politicians, whether they're doing a good job or a bad job. We asked them about their fears about COVID. Since June, we've been asking them about vaccines. We combine with this just a massive amount of data from social media, so we can understand not only what people are telling us, but what they're saying in the public corners of the internet. And what I want to do is present to you just a few snapshots of data to give you a sense of how people have responded to COVID, how it's changed over the course of the last 12 months, and how it's gotten us to this special place that we're at right now. I'll try it after that to sort of characterize what this place is and ask the question of whether it is a pivot point. I think it might be, and I'll tell you what I think that means. And then I'll look forward to a conversation with Jamison about it. And I look forward to your questions and hopefully whatever answers I can provide. So let me take the risk here of sharing my screen and seeing if I can get this up here. And I'll just show you a few. I'll show you a few slides here. I think you can see that, and that's worked fairly well. So one of the things that my lab regularly asks people about is what behaviors they're taking in response to COVID-19. And early on, we started asking them about very basic social distancing behaviors that they might take in the face of the pandemic. Things like increased hand washing, avoiding public transit, avoiding crowded places, avoiding meeting with people from outside of their household. And because we've been asking these questions since March, of 2020, we're able to track with quite a bit of precision, and certainly over time, how the dynamics have changed in people's responses to COVID. So this is a little figure that shows you people's aggregate level of social distancing. So we asked people about 4 different social distancing behaviors in this graph, and the percentage here is the percentage of those 4 that the average person tells us that they're taking in the previous week. We've broken it up here by age groups, where the dark blue is all of Canadians on average. The red are older Canadians, 55 and over. The pink are those between 35 and 54 years of age. And the light blue are those who are between 18 and 34 years of age. And what you can see here are a few things, right? There's actually quite a bit of information in this one exhibit. The one thing you can see is that at the start, when we started surveying people, so on March 26th, we started asking them about the week previous. So we were in the field really a week after the pandemic was declared. And at that point in time, about the average Canadian was abiding by about 3/4 or 3 out of the 4 behaviors that we asked them about. So we start out pretty high. And you can see though that even then there was variation between the oldest Canadians, the red line, and the youngest Canadians, the blue line. And then over time, you can see what happens, right? It starts to decline to such an extent actually that by the summertime, for Canadians who are aged 18 to 34, when we ask them, are you washing your hands more? Are you avoiding public transit? Are you avoiding crowded places? Are you seeing friends outside of your house? The average Canadian between 18 and 34 only tells us that they're doing 2 of those things. You can guess which 2 they're doing. They're probably avoiding public transit. They're probably washing their hands more, but they're not avoiding crowded places and they're not avoiding friends. There's a decline in social distancing in Canada, not a huge one, but one that is that's measurable between March and between the summertime. There's still a big gap, in fact, between older Canadians and younger Canadians. That's both heartening and rational in some sense. Older Canadians are at a bigger risk to COVID, so they should be taking more precautions. But the important part of the story is that once we get into the fall, what we see is that for younger Canadians, they never really pick up again their compliance with social distancing. It sits around 50%, while older Canadians return to that benchmark that they were at before of 3 out of 4 behaviors. We can talk more about why that is. Our lab's done a lot of work with very, very detailed what we call contact diaries, asking people about all the people they've met with in the last week with colleagues at the University of Guelph. And the basic story is that a lot of people are forced out of social distancing because they need to work and because they find themselves engaging in necessary behaviors like going to a workplace or going to school, a university or something like that, where they having to travel for some other reason, where they have to use public transit, they have to get into crowded places. But the first story here is the 2 sides of the coin are Canadians complied with social distancing at the start and they've kept some of it up, but it's fallen away over time and it's never recovered to the levels that we had that a year ago among the whole population. There's something else that's going on that's pretty remarkable right now. We're in the middle of a global pandemic. Our economy contracted by more than 5 percentage points last year. That's not a statistic that's meaningless. It represents a very large number of job losses, of businesses lost, of people, if not losing aggregate income because they were backstopped by government, losing things that they poured their heart and their soul into that were their passions. It's a number that represents a lot of tragedy. And yet, in the 4 elections we've had since the start of COVID, New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, British Columbia, I'm missing one more, well, Newfoundland's having one now, incumbents have been returned every time. Governments, it seems, are not punished in this time of COVID. And in fact, it's been a great time for politicians to stand up and be able to say straight to the camera all the great actions they're taking to address an issue with which almost all the public is seized. So the story with governments in Canada is that citizens' approval of governments has been remarkably high throughout the pandemic. That's part 1 of this story. So this graph shows you the net approval of the federal government in its handling of COVID. It's a similar story for provincial governments and for local governments. So when we see a number of 0.5, it tells you that 50% more people net say they approve versus they disapprove of the government's handling. So most governments in Canada, all governments in fact, start out net positive in March. And they really kind of hold that line of approval all the way through the summer. But you can see that it starts to fall off by the fall. And now we're at a place where, as of 2 weeks ago, in our data period ending in the middle of February, so 3 weeks ago, for the federal government, outside of Atlantic Canada, as many Canadians disapprove of the federal government's handling of COVID as they approve. So the part A of this story is that we started out with pretty remarkable approval of what governments were doing. That approval was bipartisan or cross-partisan, is widely shared across the political spectrum. But over time, that's eroded, just as social distancing has eroded. It hasn't yet got into the red, where governments are net losers in terms of their approval, but it's getting there. The one thing that hasn't changed over the course of the pandemic is vaccine willingness. We began asking Canadians in June because it became pretty clear then that a vaccine was coming online. In fact, these mRNA technologies are so impressive. The vaccines have been ready for a long time. They've just had to go through approval processes that are very important. But when we started asking people in June of 2020 whether they would take a vaccine when it became available, about 65 to 70% said they would take the vaccine. And that effectively has been unchanged over that whole period of time. Sentiment, when we look online, what people are saying on Twitter, for example, about vaccines, has actually been increasingly positive over the course of the pandemic. So there's been these two, to me, kind of interesting trends going on, three interesting trends. One is that people have complied with social distancing, often at great social and personal cost, but it's declined over time. That's changed. People approved of the government's actions across all levels, federal, provincial, local, in their handling of the pandemic over the last 12 months, but that's declined over time as well, to the point now where it's basically an even draw. And over all that time, what hasn't changed is Canadians' willingness to take a vaccine. The overwhelming majority of Canadians, 2/3, are willing to take a vaccine. There's a share that say that they are unsure. They'll come online at some point once they see the benefits of the vaccine. So that's been the part that's been unchanging. That, I think, has probably been the part that's been the holdout for people who have been looking for a way out of this, who've been wondering if there's some light at the end of the tunnel. It hasn't been that they thought that we could crush the curve via social distancing, because we never did it hard enough to actually do that. We've merely sort of kept a lid on things, but they've hoped that a vaccine would come through. Now there are vaccines. 4 have been approved in Canada, and every day we're hearing reports of more coming into the country, and they're coming in seemingly remarkable volumes. But it turns out 1 million a week takes 35 weeks to get 35 million people with 1 dosage. It takes 70 weeks to get 35 million people with 2 dosages. So are we at a pivot point? What's the pivot point? I think there is a pivot point somewhere between the hope for a vaccine, the threat of variants, fatigue with social distancing, and exhausted patients. And where we are in the mix of those things, maybe Jamison and I can tease out in conversation. But if you ask me the question, are we at a pivot point and what is it? I think the answer has to be yes. Thanks very much. And Jamison, I'm really looking forward to chatting about this.
Thank you, Peter. That's really interesting research. Well, let's just start there. When you talk about the pivot point, give me a sense of where you think the most likely pivot is going to go. As I look at your data points, you've got a decline in social distancing, a decline in government approval. Is it that that the social license is evaporating for governments, or is it just the social patience? The weather's getting better. I have a 14-degree day and I've got a vaccine on the doorstep. I hear your rules, but I'm going to go have a barbecue with my friends. Where do you see the pivot going?
Yeah, I think the challenge is in that combination of things that you've talked about. So to be sure, the lockdowns we've gone through have been costly. I have 2 young kids. I had one school age and wasn't in school for a lot of last year, and it was just immensely difficult for him. It was difficult for us as parents too, and that was costly. But we never locked down hard. And I don't mean like a Wuhan, China authoritarian lockdown. I mean like they do in Melbourne, Victoria or something, right? Where you're allowed out of your house for an hour a day. You can't be more than 5 kilometers from your house. You're only allowed out to exercise or for essential activities. And you will be fined if you're found outside of that 5-kilometer radius from your home. We never had those types of lockdowns. My concern is that we get the combination of the following factors: that the new variants continue to outpace the existing variant. They appear to be. Peter Juna today was saying that these are representing 40% of the new variants, particularly B117 is representing 40% of cases in Ontario. So the new variant starts to rip through. So that sets something up, right? In response to that, governments affect another harder lockdown. And the big point there will be on schools, I think, but also, parents are starting to get their kids back into activities through the spring. So you start locking down not only schools, but other social activities. We won't make the mistake again of locking down parks like we did last spring, which I think is a good thing. But while the conditions are getting nicer outside, you start getting lockdowns on behavior. The challenge is that if these variants are as infectious as they claim to be, and they are as infectious as they claim to be, you can't lock down to the degree you locked down before and get the same results. You have to lock down farther. So you end up having to either enforce things more, and really it's now an issue of enforcement, right? I mean, in Toronto, we basically shut everything down through that hard lockdown, but people were still walking around, et cetera, et cetera. You know, they were still going to some stores. So you have those things happening, and that's costing people and it's disappointing. And then people realize that the vaccines really aren't coming that quickly.
Yeah.
That it sounds like a lot when you're talking about 1 million doses coming in a week, but of those million, let's assume that we can only actually get 800,000 in people's arms because we've got all sorts of delivery problems, right? And then, so even if you're getting 1 million, you're only doing 800,000. It still takes a long time to get those out across the whole country in a way where you can actually see any social results from them, right? So what happens at that point in time? I mean, there's not going to be a revolt. I think it's probably a combination of two things. One is that people simply just comply less. Yeah. They just at the margin are more willing to go to their friend's house on a weekend. They're more willing to have someone over for a barbecue, or they're more willing to have their grandparents into their house with masks on or something, but they're just complying less. And if all of us comply a little bit less, the cumulative effects of that are very big. But the second point is that it really starts to erode approval for governments. And what we haven't seen yet through this, Jamison, is we haven't seen how governments manage the pandemic when they're in a net negative situation where they really don't have public approval. And if I could just push it one step farther, if I asked you, how well is Canada doing with COVID? Or if I asked you, how well was Canada doing as of last December with COVID? It's actually pretty hard to know how we're doing relative to other countries, right? Like, unless you're on ourworldanddata.com every day, you don't know what the per capita death rates are. You don't really know what our economic performance was vis-a-vis other countries. Like, there aren't kind of ready measures that will tell you exactly how we're doing. The scoreboard is pretty complicated, but it's not complicated now. Joe Biden today said he's going to have enough vaccines for every American adult to be vaccinated by May 1st. That's 50 days from now.
Yep.
Right? So that's an easy scoreboard, right? Israel, 100%. The UAE, right? They're over 70%, 80%. So we're going to see these other countries. There's European countries that are doing poorly. We'll see that they're doing poorly. We're doing well vis-a-vis them. But the evidence now, or the metric, becomes a lot clearer, right? You can just tell. And when you pick up your phone and you can't get an appointment for a vaccine, and you know that everyone in the United States of America, which has handled COVID abysmally up to now, is vaccinated, right, then you start to say, this is tough.
Yeah, there's an element, a friend of mine put it best, that they did everything wrong for the first 8 innings and then hit a homer in the 9th. And
grand slam.
It's ignoring the loss of life and the loss of the economy in the first 8 innings, but there's some real issues there. Let me read you one quick quote I saw today from Dr. Staney Brown, co-chair of Ontario's COVID Science Advisory Table, said, quote, "Our behavior over the next few weeks is critical in determining the quality of our summer." What struck me about that quote was, to what you were just saying, sort of the duty that we owe each other as citizens, regardless of what rules are there, and the desire and the abilities to make good decisions. Are you seeing an increasing lack of social cohesion? Like, do people require that hard lockdown to recognize that the actions that they take might affect not only their immediate circle, but communities beyond, beyond their own? Number one. And number two, because I know it's of interest to you, what more information could we be getting to citizens to allow them to make better decisions? Is there something missing from the mix that would would have your lines going in the direction that you'd want them to be going in?
Yeah, these are really good questions. So here's the challenge of COVID, right? I mean, this is very academic, but this is fundamentally an ontological problem. That if I tell you to stay home, if I tell everyone to stay home, everyone stays home, and COVID doesn't spread, what do you conclude from that? Well, you can conclude that staying home works, right? You can also conclude that this thing was never a threat. I don't know anyone that's died from it, right? I mean, and we know, because if you believe the epidemiology behind it, and there's every good reason to believe it, you understand that staying home slows down transmission, and we've seen what happens as transmission goes up and down, right? Mm. But I think that the challenge here is that it's very difficult. It's very difficult to see a direct link between your behavior and the outcome of your behavior in this case, right? Because this disease it's a game of probabilities. Some of us carry it asymptomatically and share with other people and never know that we've infected other people, right? But it's a game of numbers. So if you never see the results of your behavior, it becomes hard to sustain that a long time, over a long period of time. The other thing I would say is that, and this is with all due respect to Steny, but you just brought him up as an example. The Prime Minister said something similar, right, last fall. He said, look,
Right.
we can't have Thanksgiving so we can have Christmas. And then we didn't have Christmas, right? So it probably is true that what we do now for the next 2 weeks will really determine where the summer goes. But it's probably also equally likely that actually there might be new variant escape. And whatever we do now, the summer is still going to stink until we get vaccines online, right? So there is, I worry a little bit, to tie it into your second question about public health communication, that there is a bit of a crying wolf problem here, that we keep being told, this is the big one, we really have to prevent this one, you've got to take some actions, just hold on, and then something else comes. And for me, the counterfactual is, and I don't know the answer to this, right? But what would have happened if, and I don't even know if politicians could have done this, but if everyone had been more square with each other last spring and had said, we're actually buckling in here, not for a 3-week and let's crush the curve thing, but we're buckling in for a generational challenge, right? That this is the most difficult thing that really, this is the most difficult thing that most of you are going to do in your lives over the next 12 months. Now, if that had been done, this is totally hypothetical, but if that had been done, here's a couple of possible consequences of that. One is that people may have lined up their expectations better. I can tell you that even right now, we had our report on waiting being the hardest part pointed out that 25% of Canadians think that they'll have to practice social distancing for less than 6 months,
Right.
as of January. Incorrect. It's going to be longer than that, right? But if we'd calibrated people properly, maybe they would have been more ready for it, right? I think the other thing is, though, and this is really counterfactual, but it's not clear to me. It seems to me that if we had given people a sense of how long this thing was going to look like earlier on, governments may have been able to build more support for two things. One, much more rapid approval of vaccines. And the second is a much more aggressive use of technology to test and trace and isolate, and a much more invasive use of testing. That they would have said it's going to become normal for you to be tested all the time for this thing with some pretty noisy tests, but we're going to do everything we can to get this testing online, because that's the only way we can return to normal in 6 months. What we've had instead of that is sort of government saying 3 weeks and then it's going to be okay, and okay, another 2 months, then it's going to be okay, and it all adds up. And you look at your watch and you're like, was that a year ago that happened, right? And then sometimes you think, I can't believe it was only a year ago, but I think that what should have been done earlier on was to square up earlier on. So I think now the question is, can governments communicate a narrative about what people need to do over the next 4 or 5 months to hold on?
Right.
We're in October and we're in March. We're looking really at October, the 10th month. We've got about 7 months to go, right, with the vaccine. So it's about kind of tying people off for 7 months and getting them ready to do this. Basically, do what they've done now, 50% more again.
Yeah, it's interesting. Governments typically under promise, over deliver, and
Yes.
they attempt to anyway. And this was one of those situations where it seemed they didn't want to do that in the first instance. Even an answer, I'm not sure how long this is going to last, would have been more acceptable at that time. I want to take one slight skew, which is we've seen some. My hometown is St. Catharines, and so Niagara had a bit of a flare up of this, but not a huge rise of civil unrest or American populism. In Niagara, they had the call. There was some threats against the chief medical officer down there, which were disappointing. We haven't seen much of that. Is that an accurate? Is that just my read, or is that part of our mix?
I think it's fair. I think it's a fair reading. I mean, I think we don't have politicians stoking it up too much. There are some. There's this anti-lockdown caucus, and there's some people who are pushing these things. But no, I think we haven't had much on that end. One side of it is that Canadians are pretty compliant. The other is that frankly, the federal government in particular has done a lot to forestall income loss and other things that are generating, that in other places have generated opposition to lockdowns, right? let me put the question back to you in some sense, though, right? Which is that if everybody agrees with what the government's doing, are they pushing hard enough? That's a possibility, right? That's kind of a sign that actually we're kind of cutting it down the middle, right? I don't think that's actually it's a question. I don't think it's a totally fair characterization of it in this case, because frankly, I think governments have done a pretty good job of communicating why they're doing things and what they're doing, and they have genuinely built public support for them.
Yeah, generally, I think the public health communications has had some particular challenges. I know you and I, sorry to be Toronto centric for a moment, but when they opened up cottages, marinas, and golf courses, but closed down the largest urban park in Toronto, I know you and I were ready to take to the streets.
Seems curious to me.
And hopefully they don't make that same mistake here again. Let me ask, because you prompted another question there with cutting down the middle, and Dorothy mentioned the specter of a possible election. Is that starting to enter your thinking? Do you see it as a realistic possibility? Is the rise in partisanship a result of that? Or is it because as that number gets closer to the 50-50, the sense of blame starts to rise?
Yeah, I can't make heads or tails whether there's going to be an election, to be honest with you. I mean, it seems to me that, Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the Democratic Party, has said there won't be one. And that's not totally in his control, right? But if he says there won't be one, and if he sticks to his guns on that, then the only way there would be an election is if the Conservatives decide to defeat the government in the House, or if the Prime Minister simply goes to the Governor General and makes a case that, well, in this case, goes to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who's acting as the Governor General, and makes the case. So I don't know how as much as the Prime Minister may want to have an election now, I don't know that he does, but even if he does want to get there, I don't know how he gets there without it being a little bit complicated politically. I mean, I would hope that, I mean, there's another, we're kind of in fantasy land here, but just imagine one more thing. Imagine that last June or last May, even April, the federal government had said, this is a national emergency. And we're actually going to invite into the cabinet the other two large national parties. We're going to give them a seat at the table, and we're going to treat this as a national emergency for the next 12 months. And this is the broad set of policies on which we've agreed to act, right? And we're together in fighting this thing, right? They would have had a lot more social license to do things. It's very hard to do politically. It's kind of dreamland. But that's a world in which they could have done something. Instead, if you're an opposition party, you're in a tough position right now because you're trying to figure out how to criticize the government without saying that you think COVID is unimportant. And all the parties think COVID is important, but they're trying to find a way to criticize the government and to hold it to account. So just two more kind of related thoughts to answer this question for you. I don't see how we get to an election, and I would hope that a government would see through the choices it's made and see through to the end of the vaccination phase. Electing a new government right now and having an election is not going to speed up vaccinations. That's the only thing that gets us out of this situation. So all parties should be ready for this government to ride out this vaccination phase, and then each of them can prosecute their cases for whether the government does or doesn't deserve re-election. But anyone that's trying to kind of take advantage of the situation we're in right now for electoral gain, I think it's actually, I think it's politically punishable. It's not illegal. I don't know if it's immoral, but it's certainly something that, you can make a political case. You can make a political case. Against.
One slightly not off topic, but let's be hopeful for a moment and say we get to that moment where we not only pivot, but we pivot not out of a pandemic, whether we ever actually get out of it in the longer term. What are some of the policy victories or wins that you've seen over the last year that you think might stick around, that you think might have some traction going forward as part of our policy mix?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, boy, the government was really good at giving people money, and that's not nothing, actually, right? I mean, it takes a lot to move that amount of money around, and they've in fact found different ways to do it, right? Through rent supports, through wage subsidies, direct to citizens. So I really admire that policy dynamism that the federal government in particular put in place to deal with income loss. And I think that if we look over the next 20 years, one of the defining features of the next 20 years is that people are going to have a lot more uncertain job prospects than they had for the 20 years previous in terms of how long they'll last in any job or what mix of jobs they'll be having. So, excuse me. So what I would hope is that when this is done, one thing we can do is just take a pause and say, in terms of the income support that we've got here and the way we've deployed it, some to employers, some to people, what toned down or severely adulterated mix of this would we want that would support people who are in gig work or people who are in more temporary work situations? So that's one thing that I think is a victory. We kind of rethought income support a little bit.
Yep.
And I think that we could do more. We could do more with that. I think there's two more things at the level of practice which I've been impressed by. I don't think they've been done perfectly, but I've been impressed by them. The federal government and the provincial partners have, for the most part, worked together quite well. And I think that they've shown that a lot of the conflict that often exists between the federal government and the provincial governments is really just kabuki theater. It's just, and you've been in this business.
Yep.
It's I'm gonna make my argument because the other side's gonna make their argument, and we've seen that it can be pretty productive when these sides work together cooperatively. So I hope that kind of practice of more cooperative policy making, if not cooperative federalism, can continue on. And the second thing is that I think our politicians actually through this have gotten pretty good at listening to scientific experts. Not perfect, but the scientists aren't perfect either, right? Well, at the same time, asserting themselves often quietly and not explicitly in making trade-offs on behalf of citizens. The choices that politicians have made around when to open things up and when to close them are very difficult choices because there actually isn't a scientific answer for when to do those things, right? It is a really complex mix of economic costs with social cost in exchange for health benefits. And anyone who tells you that there's no trade-offs in this and that it's very obvious what you have to do, I don't think that person is telling you the truth. I think it's very difficult, actually. And I think that our politicians have learned, they've had to be quick studies at this, about what it means to make scientifically guided policy in a political context. And I hope that more of that can be done going forward on things like climate change, on things like healthcare funding and the models of how we deliver healthcare in terms of income supports. So I think that's a positive thing that has come out of this. Let me though just raise one negative thing that's come out of it for people to think about. What's the government that's performed best on COVID across the country? Arguably the government of the Northwest Territories, but among all only provincial governments, and the federal government, it's almost certainly the government of Nova Scotia. They've had a very small number of deaths from COVID. They've done a very good job of containing outbreaks when they've happened. They've built and maintained social consensus around that. For how many days has the Nova Scotia Legislative Assembly sat in the last year? 1 day.
Is that right?
A government that's operated, and they've changed the premier.
Right.
Yep. So a government that's operated with great success through the COVID pandemic, with government action closely following what citizens want, like the kind of thing we want in a democracy, their parliament has sat for 1 day.
Right.
I think that raises really interesting and important questions about what the heck these parliaments do. And I know what they do. I study them. But how necessary are they if we can have this kind of performance from a government without a parliament ever sitting?
Well, versus the common public refrain of when the legislature isn't sitting, you're all off. You're
all off. What are you doing, right? And or you need the legislature to hold governments to account to make them do what citizens want.
That's right.
I wish our legislature sat all the time.
Yes.
But it's an interesting observation to ask how our politics gets made.
Well, and three things for people to think about, I guess, not where there's been victories, but areas that feel that they will be ripe for reform, for what it's worth. And I know we've talked about this, Peter. One is public health, pandemic response. Is our division of public health units and the funding of public health across our province appropriate? If you believe this is the last one, then fine. If you believe this is just the start of these types of situations, then maybe it's not the right response. The second one is both public education, sort of both at the elementary, secondary, and post-secondary level. And then lastly, I think the disease or the virus has really exposed some of the socioeconomic aspects of our society that we all talked about, but this has brought it into greater relief. And it'll be interesting to see how all levels of government deal with those three challenges, I think, going
Yes.
forward. It might be
Yes.
might be an interesting area. One last question for me, and then I'll turn to some of that. We're getting some 17 Q's and A's coming up, Peter. So I'll go through those. But do you think, I'm putting you on the spot, we're virtually here in Northumberland. So do you think the regional choice, the choice to go with regional lockdowns has accelerated the move towards a pandemic pivot point, or has decreased it? If we'd all been in this together, if everyone had been locked down, but it was because of particular regions, would that have accelerated that pivot? Or it's a tough question. I know it's a counter hypothetical to a certain extent, but just wondering what you think
Yeah.
about the regional response.
Yeah, I'm not sure, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that I'm from North Bay, as you know,
Mhm.
which I'm very, very proud of North Bay, and it's a beautiful place. And it's Nipissing Parry Sound, which is the kind of the two public health districts that are together there, have done remarkably well through COVID,
Mm.
right? And then they got nailed by the variant 4 weeks ago. And it was likely a traveler coming back from London who then visited his parents in an apartment building in North Bay, and then the variant spread through that apartment building. So there were 40 cases in a couple of days. Really, I mean, they got a hold of it, right? But the challenge is that for a place like that, they did really well through most of COVID, right? And people were observing social distancing, but quite a bit less, I would say, actually, at a behavioral level, because they had to do it less, and then you spend a lot of time outdoors, et cetera, et cetera. And then a variant starts to rip through, and if you're not ready for it and you don't kind of have the behavioral habits to forestall it, then it can really come through quickly. So I think that's one of the trade-offs of the regional approach. That said, I think if you'd gone a hard lockdown across the whole province, right, it just wouldn't have worked, right? There would have just been too much resistance to it. And as I understand it, the response has been highly locally varied. For example, in
Yes.
Victoria, in the state of Victoria in Australia. So places that have gone for hard lockdowns have generally gone for severe lockdowns, have gone tight on the geography, and then severe with the lockdown.
Well, it's been interesting, I think, from afar, looking at other jurisdictions, and you're more well versed in this. When there has been a regional difference, they've usually been accompanied by travel restrictions.
Yes.
Right. So as opposed to here, where you have a regional difference and you can drive to, in Toronto, an hour north and get your hair cut, go skiing.
Whatever you like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that causes some challenges for those communities as well.
It sure does.
It's not fair to any. So let me open up some of the Q's and A's. So one of the first questions. So why did you lump together so many of the older people together, all over 55? Would it have been more meaningful to differentiate between true elderly and the pre-retirement older folks? Did you see a difference in behavior between sort of 55 to 65 and then 65 and older?
Yeah, that's a very fair question. It's a very fair question. So yeah, if we'd broken it up for those who are I don't know what elderly is anymore, but if we'd broken it up for those who are over 70 or over 65 and those who are below it, you would see more compliance with social distancing among the older group. I'll say two things about what drives that. I mean, one is that just by necessity, it's a bit easier when you're out of the workforce, as soon as you're out of it, to comply with social distancing, because the pressure to move is lower. That's
Right.
the first point. The second point is that the biggest driver of people's compliance with social distancing is their concern over COVID. Very obvious, right? Like, you don't need to be a professor to figure that out, but concern over COVID and assessed personal risk for COVID is highest among Canadians who are older. So the higher they go up that income chain, that age ladder, the more likely people are to be concerned about COVID personally. So the more likely they are to socially distance. So yeah, if we broke out that 55 and older group, you'd see even more variation. We lump them together because it's easier to see 4 lines than it is to see 8.
Fair enough. This is kind of related to this. That one of the next questions is, it seems that younger people may be taking a harder view of the value of the elderly. I sense a growing indifference to the numbers of deaths in long-term care, accompanied by comments by young people that they resent the restrictions they must endure to, quote, gain a few years of life for old people who are going to die soon anyway. I don't know if your data, I think, is more on the survey side, but do you get any comments like that? I mean, not to make causation and correlation the same thing, but in your chart, it seemed the young people, the adherence to social distancing seemed to coincide with weather on your chart there. The number of people social distancing when the weather got warm decreased remarkably. Is that fair, or was it just fatigue?
there's two things to say about it. So that's a really it's a really well put question.
Yeah.
And there's some poignancy in it actually. I think I think this really is a remarkable thing that's happened for the last year, that lots of people have engaged in personally costly behavior to help other people. So the other way of thinking about that question is to think about all those kids who do stay home because they do recognize that they want to help people who are in the later years of their lives. And a lot of people are doing that. That's a flip side of the people who aren't doing it. At the same time, I think, the way we talk about this does reveal a certain rationality, but also certain callousness in our society. Just because a person only has a few years of life left, why wouldn't we try to save those lives, right? And thinking about quality adjusted years is a funny way of thinking about people's lives in some sense. So I think there's a longer, to say, at a moral level and a normative level, there's a really deep conversation we need to have about the depth of the sacrifice that's been made and why people made it and how they thought about it, right? Because I think we need to look back on this period of time as one of actually really important sacrifice, and to figure out what we need to venerate, and I don't want to equate these things perfectly because they're very, very different, but for so many of us, we've got in our history and our families people who trudged off to sign up to go to war when they were young. And I don't know if they did it for adventure, and I don't know if they did it because they wanted to get off the farm in Manitoba, but they did it for some reason, and they did it, right? And we look back now and we recognize with the full light of history that it was a sacrifice they're making for other people. Yeah. Whatever their sense of adventure was, they were sacrificing for other people. And hopefully we can do some of that out of this thing. To your question about the weather, so we have a paper, Jamison, that looks at what happened in May when the April jobs report was released. This was a long time ago.
Yep, I remember.
People aren't going to remember this, but when the report came out in May, so it talks about job loss in April. So I've got my months right. It was a massive loss of jobs, much worse than anybody expected. And the reaction of young people to that news and the kind of accompanying conversation was basically to say, this is too much. Everybody's losing their jobs. Forget this. I'm going out. Right. So the weather's nice, but it was the trigger of them realizing how costly that first lockdown was going to be.
No, and well put. I don't know if people have seen it, but there's a great German ad talking about the sacrifices we need to make for this generation. And it's an ad 20 years in the future. And
right.
This generation describing we had to stay home and watch TV.
Yeah, we had to stay home and watch TV.
This was the sacrifice we had to make. I'm going to bounce around a little bit. One of the questions, it's an interesting one, and then one selfishly that's been on my mind. Has COVID made the concept of a universal basic income more publicly acceptable?
Yeah, that's a great question. My intuition is no. And I normally these questions are asked by people who are advocates of or like universal basic income. So I apologize for maybe giving an answer you don't want. But my sense is that the deficit, when we finally get a budget, the deficit number is going to be pretty eye-popping. And people are going to see how costly it is to send out cash to everyone. Now, I know the logic of the basic personal income, and I understand or universal basic income rather, and I understand that when it's properly implemented, you make all sorts of trade-offs on the taxation side and the social spending side. So I understand this is not a perfect demonstration of it, but I think that this is going to kind of blow out some public support for the idea that we would just give people money for virtue of them being Canadians. Yeah. So I think it's actually probably set it back a few years.
It has been interesting, some of the tools that have been left on the sidelines. Basic income, class sizes remains an untouched tool.
Yeah, that's what my views on what I would have done if I were running the government then. Yeah.
Paid sick leave.
Yes,
these are things that haven't been.
We've been penny wise and pound foolish through a lot of these things.
Yeah, picked up yet. Another question, and I don't know if your data would get into this, but has there been any noticeable difference in compliance with social distancing and other measures between small towns and major cities in Ontario? Do you have a geographic breakdown on that?
Yeah, we do. We've got a paper coming out with from the Canadian Journal of Public Health that gets into this question. It's a complicated one to answer because urban centers have had more infection rates. Right. So if you see more compliance with social distancing, it's hard to know if it's because there's been lockdowns in those places, because people have been more scared. But as I recall from the data, and I can post a paper, there's generally more compliance with social distancing in which depends on how you ask the question, but typically in larger cities. There's also more variation though in social distancing in larger cities. So you've got more people not complying at all, and more people not complying at all, and more people complying entirely, where you don't get that much variation in smaller places.
Interesting. One of the questions, I don't know if you have the number of times I've started my sentences with "I'm not an epidemiologist," but why have our travel restrictions not prevented the arrival of variants? Can you speak to that at all? I know it's a little bit beyond our area.
Well, we really didn't have travel restrictions, right? So the number of people who cross the U.S.-Canadian border every day is still remarkable. And there's lots of people who live in Windsor and they work in Detroit, right?
Right.
So there's all sorts of exceptions that are being made for that. And there's still, you can look at the arrivals chart at Pearson. There's still lots of people flying in from outside of the country. Mm-hmm. So if you just do, you don't have to be an epidemiologist to do the math on it, right? So what's the current rate of infection in any country, right? And if it's 5%, right? And if you take a random draw of people who are getting on an airplane from Heathrow, and there's 200 of them, and 5% of them may be infected at any point in time, there's going to be 10 people on that plane that are infected, right? And now the math is a little more complicated than that, right? And someone who's actually getting on a plane is probably more likely to be infected because they're already moving around out in the population. So, but there's other things that make it less likely, but you don't need a lot to get people to come in. That said, I mean, travel restrictions are tough to impose internationally, right? And I'm neither here nor there on the argument that the government didn't lock down fast enough on Chinese flights. Most of the variants we have came in through Europe, right? They in turn came to Europe, to Italy through China, but they came via Europe. So it was hard to get this right at the start. I mean, what's the other thing I would say about it is that what's been interesting about this, Jamison, about our politics, is that we actually have had travel restrictions in the country, right? There are informal recommendations about travel, or formal recommendations about traveling in British Columbia, for example. And then the Atlantic provinces basically shut themselves off from the rest of the country and made it impossible to come into those places without a quarantine plan. And this was just clearly a violation of the rights of Canadians to move freely.
That's right.
But they were willing to do it, right? So that's part of their story of why they've been able to contain COVID.
No, it's they are our New Zealand, right?
Yes.
They were able to cut off access, and they have benefited from a health perspective as a result.
Less sheep and a better accent.
Yeah, fair enough. There's a question here around an issue that I think is going to stay with us for the next little while. So unless something real is done for long-term care and other facilities housing people who have been decimated by the pandemic, we will keep having more and more sad outcomes. The general public believed that the government was dealing with long-term care between the two waves. Actually, nothing has changed. Basically, how can the federal government hold the provinces to account for putting money over people's lives? So the question there being, what do you expect to see either from the federal or provincial government on that long-term care file? I mean, I'll give you time to think. I have to imagine it's going to be the subject of some form of inquiry, whether that's a committee, public inquiry. I'm not sure. Just the sheer number of deaths has been staggering. So we'll have to, at least here in Ontario.
Yeah. So who's done well through this, right?
Yeah.
I mean, who can be proud of their record on this? It's been it's awful, right? And there's an interesting question. I mean, I'll attribute this to someone I don't think he's going to mind, but Tom Morey, who's the old dean of medicine at the University of Alberta and Dalhousie, your alma mater. It's an amazing guy, and he said, he's worked in public health, and he's worked in government, he's worked in universities, and he's worked in the medical system, and he said he's never seen organizations that learn worse than universities or the government. But what doctors do is, they from time to time have, I guess they call them mortality rounds, where they talk about the deaths. I just learned about this. Like, everybody probably knows it, and I'm talking about it like it's a secret. But it's such an interesting idea, right? Where you have a retrospection on what happened without any blame, right? Without any consequence, right? Because you want to talk about it. You want to talk about it as plainly as possible to get to the source of the problem, right? Without everybody trying to cover their ass, basically, right? And if ever there was a time for us to say, you know what, like clearly there's been a society-wide failure in how we treat people in long-term care homes. It's just the system is busted, right? So let's actually agree not to blame anybody, and let's just actually figure out what went wrong. And then what we'll do is we'll ask people, what's your plan to fix it for next time? And maybe this is really anathema to people because people want accountability for this. But I just think, as the questioner said, unless we get it right, this kind of thing is going to happen again. So we need to like completely rethink basically some mix of how these institutions are governed and staffed. And it's really a staffing issue, right? And how they're financed. And, you know, we have to have a conversation about how we basically get people paying in now in an insurance scheme, in an insurance state, so that there'll be enough money that everybody who's in there now can live the lives, you know, live lives of proper dignity and safety and security in their final years. So I just have a sense that this one's so widespread, so systemic, no single person is responsible. And what we should do is just figure out how to fix the whole system. Maybe particular things where politicians are responsible because they should have known something was going to happen and they didn't do anything about it in a particular case. But the whole system is so broken that it strikes me that it's one where we really should just pause and say, what do we have to change? You know, how many percentage points do we have to add to the tax system? It's not going to be more than 1 or 2 at every point, to make sure that people can live out their lives properly in their final years. And it's in all of our interest to do it because the whole population is getting older.
Yes. Well, we all know how this ends, right? Like it's for all of us. And so you
Yes.
make that a dignified.
Yeah, and just to tie it back to one other point, like maybe it's very hard to affect cultural change, right? It really is, but you know, one of the big differences in our country is it's a big cultural difference, right? And it runs along different depending on your background. But whether you have your parents live with you when they get older is a really big cultural difference, right? It's very normal in some families and not normal in others. And I think rethinking how we choose to live with our elders and how we honor them in their later years, I think is really one of the challenges that we should be up for.
Agreed.
For talking about.
At least 2 more questions. One of the questions was, for how long do you expect social distancing, mask provisions to be in effect beyond, like until herd immunity? Like if you had to the extent that you have a crystal ball, Peter, what do you see going forward on some of these restrictions that we're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think masking is certainly here for the rest of the year. I think restrictions on large gatherings certainly here for the rest of the year. The CDC has said that fully vaccinated adults can safely be with one another in a home unmasked, right? And that's fine because they can't infect each other, but it's still unclear whether or not whether having the vaccine will prevent you from infecting someone else. So I think the basics of masking and basic social distancing are going to be with us for the rest of the year. Just remark though, I would commend people to look at flu rates over the last this winter. It's remarkable how much the flu has just bottomed out. Some of that's probably diagnosis, but like when people wear masks everywhere, it's just a much healthier society. Yep. You know, so I think one thing that's going to stick around is that it's just going to be unacceptable to cough into your sleeve anymore, right? If you're out, you got a cold, put a mask on. And I for one hope that kind of continues because I'm someone who catches a cold every Christmas, and somehow this year I didn't do it.
One other question that was coming in on the chat as well was, what future actions are going to be taken, do you believe, for those folks who don't get a vaccine? Are you seeing signs from other countries, vaccine passports, forcing people who work in long-term care, healthcare facilities to have the vaccine? Are you seeing any signs or any signals about what are the likely outcomes on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the government's going to try to avoid mandates as long as possible. Colleagues and I have actually done work measuring support for mandates globally, and so across countries that represent the majority of the population of the world. And there's normally majority support for mandates, but it's not huge. It correlates very, very closely to whether people are willing to get a vaccine themselves. I mean, I would think that, and even on Canadian schools, and only 3 of 10 provinces are vaccines mandatory. And even then, there's exceptions for reasons of conscience. So we actually don't, it's less than 24 countries in the world that require yellow fever vaccination to get in, et cetera, right? So, vaccine mandates are not as watertight as we think they are, or as common as we think they are. And my own intuition is that the incentive to get a vaccine is so high.
Yeah. And
for people who are resistant around vaccines, the resistance is sometimes so strong that I think that trying to mandate it is going to move the needle so little, right? It's not going to compel anybody to get it who is already ready to get it. And it's not going to move a lot of people who are resistant to getting it, that I'm just not sure that it's worth it politically and socially to take a really hard line right now on mandating vaccines. Like, if everybody could get one, then maybe we would start talking about what we would do with people who won't get it. But right now, 5% of Canadians are vaccinated and 80% want to be vaccinated.
Right.
So there's 75% we can work with.
Well, and as you were saying before as well, if governments had achieved a certain level of social license at this point, then maybe mandating would be easier.
Maybe it would be easier.
Several of the comments in the chat and in the Q&A are about no one has covered themselves in glory right now, right? Like whether it's the federal government, the provincial government, or local. One more question, then I'll have maybe one of a teaser for folks. So would making public the stories and details that contact tracers record have had a positive educational impact resulting in better social compliance?
I couldn't have written the question better myself.
Agreed.
I think we've missed the narrative of how people got COVID, of how they picked it up, right? And so what you do as human is that you try to imagine a reason for why the behavior you're engaging in is appropriate, right? But when you hear that behavior has caused someone else to get, or someone else that's gotten COVID while engaging in that behavior, it sends a very strong signal that behavior is the wrong behavior, right? So you sort of say, oh, I'm going to have 10 friends over, but we're going to sit inside, but we're going to be 6 feet apart from each other. You hear the story that the fan circulated COVID around the room. You realize I can't do that. I think we should have had much more narrative around how this thing spreads.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question and a great point, in that I had the misfortune, or my dark humor took me to reading The Plague in the first month of COVID. And it reminded me that human nature has never really changed. We all think we're special. We all think somehow we are immune, above things. But when you see stories that hit closer to home, it's easier to understand why the restrictions are for you. So, and
even when it's all done, you think it's all over, the last rat still comes up out of the sewer, right?
Maybe since you are a prof and I'm a recovering one from last semester, what reading or journalist, or what should people be following, Peter? Like if people want to get a diversity of information, or they want to try to stay up to speed, there's so much information out there right now. Sometimes it's a little bit too much, but is there someone you'd suggest that for folks to follow in the weeks and months ahead, aside from yourself, of course?
No. I would. Here are 3 people I would recommend people follow or read if they want to kind of track what's going on. David Naylor, the former president of the University of Toronto, has a hilarious Twitter account where it's mostly him relaying conversations he's having with his dog, and he may actually be having them. I'm not sure, but they're humorous, but they really put things on point. I think pretty well. The second is Lawrence Wright, who's one of my favorite journalists. I don't actually know if Lawrence Wright is still writing about COVID, but he wrote the huge retrospection. It's a single issue of the New Yorker on the COVID pandemic in Europe, and that's just a very, very elegant one to follow. And the final thing I would say is they should read their local newspaper to see how it's reporting on COVID, both to keep supporting local newspapers, but also if you want to get narratives of how things are spreading, how people are thinking about stuff with kind of at the street level, local papers are a great place to do it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, I would add in Andre Picard and his most recent book on long-term care as well. Obviously, kind of required reading for some of this going forward. But listen, obviously, people probably pick up. You and I are friends and colleagues, but it was a pleasure to listen to you. Thank you for all your work. And obviously, if we have 114 people on a Thursday night willing to give a little over an hour and a half of their time, I'm pretty sure they'll take up some of these readings. So
I really appreciate people coming, and I appreciate the chance. And it was great to chat, Jameson.
Likewise. Elizabeth, over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Ivory. I'm the chair of Northumberland Learning Connection. First of all, I just want to thank Peter and Jamison for a fascinating presentation on a subject that we thought we knew a lot about, but there's always more, and it's changed our lives. We hope it won't be continuing to do that forever. One of the subjects they brought up was the importance of long-term care and how we come out of this with a better model for that. In the next couple of months, we've got a bunch of really great speakers coming up. One of them will be sociologist and Professor Pat Armstrong, who's going to talk about reimagining long-term residential care. So keep that in mind, and we'll be communicating about that. But before then, we're going to take a bit of a pivot to something more entertaining and light. On April 15th, NLC will welcome Barry Blitt to this stage, if you will. Barry Blitt is the Pulitzer Prize winning New Yorker editorial cartoonist who you probably have seen. You may not know his name, but I'm sure you've seen his work. I'm going to share my screen to show something. This is his winning depiction of Trump leaving the White House, one of the covers that won him the Pulitzer Prize. And he's going to speak to us about his experiences in that world. He's very entertaining. He happens to also be a Canadian, so that's great. So that's April 15th. When you get the email about it, please register and share it with your friends so that even more people can enjoy it. So in a couple of seconds, I'm going to end the webinar officially. When I do hit that button, a small and short survey will show up on your screen. If you wouldn't mind answering a couple of really quick questions, your feedback is so valuable to us here at NLC. And if you don't have time, an email will arrive with the same survey. So thank you so much for spending your evening with us, and we look forward to seeing you again on April 15th. Have a good evening, everyone.